Once Grant took full control of the Army of the Potomac in the east, he latched on to Lee's army and refused to let go. Sherman, in the meantime, has driven all the way to Savannah and started marching northward, squeezing Johnston, who was sort of protecting Lee's back, up northward. So now what you have is Lee and Johnston stuck between Grant and Sherman's armies. Lee is in danger of being surrounded. If his army gets captured, gets surrounded and besieged in the capital of Richmond, which is where he's pulled back to, they're done for. And so Lee tries one last desperate maneuver gamble. And on April 9th, he finds himself surrounded near the town of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And that morning, he's going to try one last time to break free of the circle of Grant's troops, but he fails. And the reason he fails is his army is just done in. They're worn out. They have practically no ammunition. Their weapons are just in terrible repair. They're dressed in rags. They're hungry. A lot of them are marching barefoot. They've got virtually no medicine. They've done everything they can do, and yet they're going to lose. They're just done. They don't have anything left. And so at about noon, Lee will send a messenger to Grant under a white flag offering to surrender. Grant will accept this offer, and they meet that afternoon at a private home in the county seat at Appomattox Courthouse and sign the documents. Interestingly, the person who owns that home had owned a farm in Northern Virginia back in 1861. That farm was along Bull Run, and part of the battle was fought on, the first major battle of the war was fought on his land. He had since then sold his farm and moved further south to get away from where all of this fighting was taking place. And yet here he is being the person at whose home the surrender documents will be signed. With the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, the South's main primary army is gone. They're actually the largest army that they had that was actually in the best shape. So the South's ability to fight any longer is just gone. The rest of the troops will surrender in the coming weeks. Some of them never even officially surrendered. They just were told the war was over and went home and never actually surrendered. And here is a painting by Tom Lovell, pardon me, of the process of the surrender. And you have Lee signing the documents, which will then be handed over to Grant in the right in the blue, who will sign them, and it will all be taken care of. The last battle of the war on land, at any rate, is actually going to be fought in Texas. And it's known as the Battle of Palmito Ranch, and it's fought at night, and it goes over midnight, so that's why it's on May 12th to 13th of 1865. As battles go, it was really small. There were less than 200 casualties for both sides. There weren't more than a couple of thousand people on each side. Maybe 4,000 or 5,000 men to each side. So the casualties were pretty low, but it is the last fighting between organized units of the Confederate States and the United States. The outcomes of the war. You probably know that the North won. Hopefully you know that by now. Slavery is going to be outlawed and the Union is going to be preserved, which were the two big goals, particularly preserving the Union. That's really the reason the war was fought. But since the issue of slavery is what caused the division between the North and the South, they're going to get rid of that to. They're going to outlaw it to keep this from being a problem again later. It's going to cost about 620,000 American soldiers their lives. About 535,000 more people, men, soldiers, these are troops, were wounded. This does not include civilian casualties. Civilian casualties were not immense in this war, but they were significant. There were a significant number of civilian casualties in the war. Certainly nothing like you see in modern conflicts like World War II, but still pretty darn bad. One outcome of the war is that both countries got deeply into debt, about $3.4 billion in their terms, which is hundreds of billions of dollars in ours. And that was mostly the North. And then the South, of course, stopped being a separate country. And they actually had to, as part of the end of it, they had to, it's called repudiating the debt. They basically had to tell everybody, we're not going to pay you. Each of the states had to say that to the people that had loaned them money. Well, governments are like people. They have credit ratings. And if you don't pay your debts, if you repudiate your debt, say, I don't know that, then people stop loaning you money. And that's going to be a long-term problem for the Southern economy. The Southern economy had been wrecked. I mean, destroyed, wrecked, R-E-K-T, done. Not least of all by Sherman's very destructive march to the sea, but also the number of people that had died, the years that farms had gone untended, the raids on infrastructure, railroads and things that went on all over the place, north and south. All of these things cause massive damage to particularly the Southern economy. It's going to be decades, as in 1920s, before the Southern economy will recover back to the point that it was at in 1860. It takes a full lifetime before the South's economy is as productive as it was before the war. That's immense, and that's going to leave a lot of resentment. Well, what about the Emancipation Proclamation? I always hear, what about the Emancipation Proclamation? When I remind people that the slavery was ended by the war and the resulting 13th Amendment, which is ratified in 1865, one of the so-called Reconstruction amendments. The Emancipation Proclamation took place during the war. It was an executive order that Lincoln issued following the Battle of Antietam. This was the day after the Battle of Antietam, that would go into effect on January 1st of 1863. And what it said was that slaves in areas under rebellion were free. That means not in border states or regions like, say, Washington, D.C., which allowed slavery. So it frees the slaves from rebellious states. That's the Confederacy. Well, the Confederate states aren't listening to anything that Lincoln is saying. They're rebelling against him. That's like if Canada were to say that Americans could no longer have cheeseburgers, then we could no longer eat, we would stop eating cheeseburgers suddenly. Why do we care if Canada says that? The Confederates didn't care what Lincoln had to say, especially about slavery. Well, they cared, they just weren't going to listen. And so what effect does it really have? Well, it's a political move. It is purely a political move to bolster support in the North. This helps drive up support from the abolitionists, who now support the war even stronger because it has flat out become, hey, if we win, this is Lincoln announcing that if the North wins, slavery is going to go away. And that helps, like I said, to bolster support amongst the abolitionists in the North, but it also helps keep Britain out of the war. Britain had been sort of waffling and considering joining the war on the southern side. There had been some incidents. The Trent Affair comes to mind. And while the English had turned to other sources for cotton, such that the southern plan of relying on King Cotton was not such a winner, the British always had a problem with the fact that the South used slaves to grow things. They were very uncomfortable with it. A lot of them did it anyway, simply because the money was too good. But a lot of them were morally opposed and ethically conflicted in dealing with the South. And so this just helps to turn British public opinion against the South. Reconstruction is the name we give to the period and the process of readmitting the former Confederate States to the Union and integrating those freed slaves into society. And it's going to last for about 12 years, starting in 1865, as soon as the war is over, and going until 1877, when it comes to an end. Now, there were two different plans to get Reconstruction done. One is the president, meaning President Lincoln's plan that he has outlined. And so it gets called Presidential Reconstruction because, well, why not? And the second is called Radical Reconstruction. This is the one that is popular with Congress. And it's called Radical Reconstruction because Congress at the time was dominated by radical Republicans, and they were the ones who supported it. This was their basic plan. And these radical Republicans were the more hardcore abolitionists. They wanted to kind of punish the South. These are the ones that wanted to really get the South for having caused the war. And of the two, Lincoln's plan for presidential reconstruction was far more gentle, far gentler, I guess is the best way to put it. He wants to accomplish reconstruction quickly and gently without punishing very many people. Now, people like Jefferson Davis, they were thrown into jail briefly and then put on basically house arrest, things like that. They were denied the vote and some things like that. But you don't see lots of people being, imprisoned and thrown just into a dungeon and left there to rot. They will actually try one fellow for war crimes, and he was the commander of the notorious prison camp, prisoner of war camp in Andersonville, Georgia, where they kept many Union troops and killed a lot of Union troops, mainly through negligence, but also through some intentional cruelties and things. And it was the fault of this particular fellow who was the commandant of the camp. And so they tried him for war crimes and ended up hanging him. But for the most part, Lincoln doesn't want to punish people for the Civil War. He wants to move past it. And he describes what he means in his second inaugural address in 1865. He says, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive to bind up the nation's wounds and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves." That's his goal. He wants to move past this and start recovering, start healing. He doesn't want to punish people if it's not necessary. Because he understands that doing that is only going to cause more bitterness, more problems, and could lead to even a second civil war, which is obviously something he really is not interested in having happen. So presidential reconstruction didn't really require very much. The southern states would be restored to the Union, and by that we mean they get to put people back into Congress, they get to vote for president and everything. They get to participate fully in the nation again when they do just a few things. First, they had to ratify the 13th Amendment. That's the one that gets rid of slavery. Why? Because slavery was one of the big things that had caused the Civil War. In the first place, he says, we are going to solve that problem and get rid of it. He says that 10% of the people who are registered to vote must take an oath of loyalty to the United States. And this is known as the 10% plan for that reason. He says that the southern states also have to write a constitution which accepts the supreme power of the federal government. This is going to get rid of the problem of nullification or states' rights, which was the other big part of what caused the war. So now he's taking aim at the things that in his eyes are what caused the war. He says, if I get rid of these and we show that, at least a fair number of these people are willing to work within our new system or within the system, then I can pardon most of the Southerners for their role in the Civil War. They didn't go after any of the rank and file soldiers or the people who had been like, the letter carriers for the Confederate government or whatever. They don't go after those low-level guys and gals. They're just like, okay, whatever. You supported the Confederate States financially when you paid your taxes. Well, okay, we'll pardon you for doing that. You had to pay your taxes, whatever. So that's presidential Reconstruction, and as you can see, it's pretty gentle. Right? You don't see mass arrests. You don't see just the suppression of civil rights and things going on and on and on. And then Lincoln gets assassinated. President Lincoln is shot and killed while attending the theater on the night of April 14th, 1865 at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. They're watching a comedy known as Our American Cousin. He's killed by a man named John Wilkes Booth. Booth was a Southern supporter. He was a Southern sympathizer from Maryland. So not real happy with Lincoln because of some of the things that Lincoln had done with Maryland during the war. But also, he was from a famous acting family and was a fairly well-known actor himself. And so getting into the theater was no big deal for him. It was actually part of a larger plot to assassinate several other key figures in the U.S. government, including the Vice President, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State, and the Leader of the House, and Speaker of the House, and all of these folks. None of those other attacks panned out. So Booth will shoot Lincoln, leap from the balcony, yell, "Sic semper tyrannis," which means in Latin, "Thus always to tyrants," or "Tyrants always get this." And then he hobbles off because he broke his leg when he jumped to the stage, climbs on his horse and rides away. And while everybody's screaming and freaking out. But, he was an actor, so he had to have his moment on the stage, I suppose. He will be tracked down as part of a massive manhunt, will be tracked down and will be killed by soldiers who were trying to capture him. Now, were they really trying to capture him, or did they just kill him? I think personally they were actually trying to capture him, but he started shooting, they started shooting back. It happens. Several other conspirators were captured. 4 of them, I believe it was, were hanged, and another 9 or 10 were put into prison for extended stays. Lincoln's body lies in state for a few days, then they put it on a train, run it back to Illinois, and he is interred in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln's death, however, has another long-term effect. It leaves a man named Andrew Johnson president of the United States. And Johnson is not at all popular with Congress or, for that matter, most of the American public. And because Johnson is not popular in Congress, he was a pro-Union Southerner. He was actually from the South, but he had sided with the Union and had stayed in the North during the war. Now, but he's no Lincoln. Lincoln just won the war. Lincoln is charismatic. Lincoln is incredibly popular. Going against Lincoln's wishes if you were a member of the Republican Party at this time, was political suicide. It was the third rail. You don't touch it. Okay? But Lincoln's dead. Lincoln could have got presidential reconstruction through. Johnson can't. It's that simple. And so radical reconstruction is going to begin about a year after Lincoln's death. For a year, Johnson manages to use Lincoln's memory and his death as a tool to kind of try to advance the presidential reconstruction plan. But it's not going to be enough. Basically, the Congress refuses to accept these terms and begins imposing their own about a year after Lincoln died, so in April of '66. And radical reconstruction is going to be far more punitive. Okay, radical Republicans in Congress wanted to punish the South, and so they passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Under that, the South will be divided into 5 military districts and run by the Army. They have military governors. They do not have a civilian government. Governors and state governments that had been elected since the end of the war were thrown out of office and replaced with these military governments. Texas and Louisiana made up the 5th district, which was run by a man named Philip Sheridan. General Philip Sheridan, Sheridan. And Sheridan hated it here. He was from Ohio. He once said that if he owned hell and Texas, he would live in hell and rent out Texas. He would have preferred to be in hell than in Texas is basically what he's saying. So yeah, he wasn't happy here. Former Confederate leaders under the Reconstruction Act lose their right to vote. If you were an officer of the Confederate Army or Navy, you lost permanently your right to vote. If you had been a government official under the Confederate States of America, you lost your right to vote. Pretty harsh. All Southern states had to write yet another new constitution that specifically says blacks are allowed to vote, that the former slaves would be allowed to vote. And all Southern states then had to ratify the 14th Amendment. 13th Amendment, already taken care of. 14th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment frees the slaves. 14th Amendment does what? That's right. It redefines citizenship and says that everybody has to be treated equally under the law. Okay. When a Southern state did all of those things, only then could they return members to Congress and fully rejoin the Union. So here's a question you should think about. Johnson is so unpopular with Congress, he struggles with Congress so much that he will manage to get himself impeached. He will be the very first president of the United States to be impeached. Andrew Johnson. And why he was impeached was that he dismissed his Secretary of War, a man named Stanton. And Stanton had been put in the job by Lincoln. But he and Johnson don't see eye to eye. Johnson wants him gone and wants to replace him with someone who is more to Johnson's liking, happens to be a Southerner. Unfortunately, this violates a law that the Congress had recently passed called the Tenure of Office Act. Basically, what that says is that the Constitution requires Congress, basically the Senate's approval of cabinet members, okay, and all the high-level people advising the president. They have to be approved by the Senate. What this law says is that they have to get the Senate's approval to fire them as well. And the Supreme Court will later overturn it, but at the time, It was the law. And so when he fires Stanton because they really don't like each other, Congress comes after him and they impeach him and they go to the Senate for a trial. That's the basic process. You get articles of impeachment. That's like an indictment. It does not mean that you're automatically thrown out of office. That is not what it means to impeach someone, although people say it all the time like that's what the word means. It is absolutely not. You need to know the difference if you want to sound like an educated person. Johnson was impeached. He was not convicted. He was not thrown out of office. Just like William Jefferson Clinton was impeached. He was not convicted and he was not thrown out of office. Just like Donald Trump was impeached, he was not convicted and he was not thrown out of office. And it's not gonna happen. Okay. Johnson was acquitted by the margin of 1 vote. If one senator, the Senate acts as a jury during an impeachment. If one senator had changed his mind and voted the other direction, Johnson would have been convicted and he would have been expelled from office and probably imprisoned. Okay. But even though he avoids being thrown out of office and going to jail, essentially Congress looks at him and says, this guy is a nobody. We put him on trial and not one letter came in saying, hey, leave him alone. He's fair game, he's fair meat, he's dead in the water, and he essentially retires from politics because all of his authority is just gone. So let's talk for a few minutes about what Reconstruction actually did manage to achieve. And there's a few good things, short and long term, that they managed to take care of. Well, first and foremost, the former Confederate states did eventually all get readmitted into the Union as equal members of the system, of the legislature. It will see a temporary change of party control in the South to be Republicans. Okay. Democrats had controlled it. Democrats will again control it after Reconstruction, but for a period, Republicans are in control in the South. You'll also see the election of the very first African American governors, state legislators, congressmen, and senators. And the very first senator of African American descent is a man by the name of Senator Hiram Revels of Mississippi. He's the very first non-white senator to be elected. Three major amendments to the Constitution will be proposed, passed, and ratified by the states. And while they weren't evenly enforced for decades, better part of a century really, these changes were ratified, they were put in place, and they should have been enforced the entire time. And the first, of course, is the 13th Amendment, ratified 1865, in slavery once and for all in the United States, all of her territories and possessions, any place where the American flag flies, there is no slavery, period, done, the end, bump. The 14th Amendment, which is going to be ratified in 1868, defines citizenship to include the former slaves. It says that if you were born in the United States, you are, by golly, a U.S. citizen. And then it says Congress can make up all the other rules for naturalizing and everything, but bang. And it also says that everyone must be treated equally under the law. It guarantees equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment, the last of the three Reconstruction Amendments, is not going to be ratified until 1870, so it took a few more years. And what it does is it prohibits denying a citizen the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which is a very nice way of saying, or whether or not they used to be slaves or not. Okay. Notice how that is worded. That's important. You cannot deny a citizen the right to vote because of their race, their color, or their previous condition of servitude. That is entirely different from saying you can't deny a black man the right to vote. Because if you said that, if that's how it was put, then for no reason could you deny a black man the right to vote. Well, but he's insane. Too bad he can vote. Well, but he's 14. Too bad he's black, he's a man, he can vote. Okay. He's in prison for murder. Too bad he's a black, he's a man, he can vote. Okay. That's why they don't word it that way. It says you can't deny them the right because of their race or color or previous condition of servitude. So when you look at can we deny someone the right to vote, is it legal to do so? Those cannot be part of the answer to that question. Yes, because they are black. Yes, because they are Asian. Yes, because you can't do that. Yes, because they used to be slaves. It's okay to deny them the right to vote. Wrong. 15th Amendment says exactly the opposite. Oh, one thing about the 13th Amendment, it does have a bit of a loophole. It says that there will be no slavery, but it gives one exception. It says that you can be forced to work if convicted of a crime. So basically, they can make you do work if you go to prison. They can make you, without paying you, do labor. Another thing that Reconstruction achieves is the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, it never did everything it was supposed to do because, well, nobody wanted to pay for everything it was supposed to do, and so it never got the funding that it truly needed. But it did help a lot. Okay, this is an organization primarily dedicated to helping the 4 million or so former slaves get on their feet and become members of society. They provided emergency food and housing and clothing and things like that. They helped locate separated family members. If you knew where someone who had been sold off to another plantation had gone, they would help you to get in touch with them and help to relocate someone to you or you to them, depending on the case. But generally, the idea was to get people together. They started operating hospitals. Most hospitals at the time would not treat a patient who was not white. They promoted education and built schools for the young. And this is going to be truly the longest lasting effect of Reconstruction, because these people that learned how to read as young boys and girls, because they happened to be young boys and girls at the time of the Civil War, would then raise children of their own. And when they raise children of their own, they teach them how to read and to write and so on and so forth. Okay, and so that's going to start increasing the number of people who have those skills. One thing that they did was they provided lawyers to look over employment contracts and things to make sure that people weren't getting cheated. They assisted in legalizing marriages. We mentioned previously in another chapter that slave marriages weren't legally recognized. They were sacramentally recognized, but they were not legally recognized. Well, now some of these lawyers are ensuring that everyone understands that that these two people are married and that the children of that union are actually legitimate. And that was a big deal back in those days. They helped file for pension benefits, and they provided legal representation in courts. But again, they never really had the funding they needed to hire all the people they would need to help all of those people that had been freed. So it's not a complete and utter tale of just success and triumph and one after the other. It's got a lot of problems, but it was at least a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, Reconstruction also had a few serious failures at the same time. Probably the most serious of the failures was that it did not create lasting civil rights. Okay. Uh, when Reconstruction ends, the Republicans are immediately voted out of office and replaced by so-called Redeemer Democrats. These are people who want to turn the clock back as much as possible to make sure that the former slaves are definitely kept in a second-class citizen role, and so forth. And they're going to do that by enacting black codes all across the South, sometimes called Jim Crow laws, which were technically illegal. Okay, I mean, just flat out, they were unconstitutional. They got away with them anyway. They did it through a lot of loopholes, but they do start enacting black codes pretty much as soon as the Republicans are out of office, which happens basically as soon as Reconstruction ends. How long does that go for? Well, Texas doesn't have another Republican governor. Imagine Texas with a Democratic governor. Many of you have never lived in that situation. It's been quite a while since Texas last had a Democratic governor, but it was 100 years that they had nothing but Democrats as governor of the state of Texas. From the 1870s, late 1870s to 1979, which is when Governor Bill Clements is the first elected Republican governor of Texas in over 100 years. That's a big thing. So the black codes get enacted, and the Supreme Court holds them up. Okay, the Supreme Court supports them with what they call the civil rights cases, things like Plessy versus Ferguson, which is probably the most famous of them. They're going to severely weaken the 14th Amendment. Plessy versus Ferguson says, and you'll talk about it in 1302, but I'll give you a hint. Plessy v. Ferguson says that it is okay to segregate based on race. It says you can segregate based on race as long as you give both groups equal treatment. Okay, so if you're going to say that whites get one waiting room at the train station and non-whites get a different waiting room at the train station, then so long as they both have benches and they both have fans to help keep it cool and they both have restrooms, then it's okay. That's separate, but it's equal, theoretically. Of course, the benches in the white waiting room had cushions on them and were very nice, and the bathrooms in the white waiting room had flushing toilets and water fountains and so on and so forth. And the ones in the non-white waiting room, what they would have called colored waiting room, the benches wouldn't have had backs. They'd have been raw lumber and liable to get splinters sitting on them, and the fans would be broken. The restrooms would be primitive, and so on. And that kind of nonsense is going to last until the 1950s. Another failure of the civil rights in Reconstruction is they did absolutely bipkus, nothing, nada, nunc for women's rights. Okay. While they began to protect the rights of freed slaves, the male freed slaves, to vote, it did nothing to help women's rights. And so a lot of people were very upset about that. Of course, Reconstruction did not get rid of racism either. And it's during the period of Reconstruction that the Ku Klux Klan will be created the first time. And it starts in Tennessee to resist a Republican governor named William Brownlow. And it was led by a former Confederate States cavalry officer by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest, as in run, Forrest, run. Yep, he was named for him. They even mentioned it in the film. And what do? Well, they hide their faces and they use terror and violence to help Democrats seize power, to deny African Americans the vote, the freed male slaves their votes, by scaring them away. And by doing so, they mean to take control of the government back. And so basically, they're using terror and violence to enact political change. And that is literally the definition of terrorism: a group who uses terror and violence to cause political changes, to influence the political realm. That's terrorism. These guys are terrorists. In response to this, however, the federal government passes enforcement laws, including one known as the KKK Act, or the Ku Klux Klan Act, which authorizes the military to crack down on them. That's new and different. We don't traditionally use the military for police actions in this country. As a matter of fact, it's usually against the law to do so. But not in this case, because Congress says, yep, you can send the army after them. And that's exactly what the new president is going to do. A new president is elected in 1868. That's going to be Ulysses S. Grant. He takes office in 1869, and he effectively uses these laws and the military to crush the Klan. And they do. They wipe the Klan out. The Klan goes away for about 50 years. They come back in the 1920s. They start to come back. But you've got about a 45-year, 50-year stretch where the Klan, at least, is, as an organized concept, as an organization, is gone. And that's a good thing. It's just a shame that it started up in the first place. One of the most serious issues of Reconstruction, however, it's a serious issue of the outcome of the war, was the damage to the Southern economy. And Reconstruction falls into this because essentially Reconstruction didn't do very much to help it. Okay, there is a shortage of labor and nobody has any cash in the South. And that's going to slow down the Southern economic recovery after the war. Okay, even though the slaves are now free, they can't get jobs. Why? Nobody has any money to pay them. Shortage of capital made opportunities for some people, however, Northerners who would come down to buy into the South. They would come and buy land at ridiculously low prices. Why? Because people were desperate. Say you owned a farm and it was worth $10,000, which was a lot of money back then. You owned a farm worth $10,000, but you owed taxes on it, and you owed $800 in taxes on it, in U.S. federal taxes, and you had to pay it, or you were going to lose your house and go to jail and all this terrible stuff. And so some fella comes along and he says, I tell you what, I'll give you $1,500 right now, cash money, $1,500 for that property. Well, if you're that desperate, if you've tried everything else, you may just sell. And so he gets this huge deal, and you can pay off your taxes and avoid prison, but you've just given away land that maybe your daddy or granddaddy or great-granddaddy had struggled to turn into something. And now you don't have a way to support yourself because you're not a farmer anymore. Can't be a farmer without land, right? Okay. And people felt like these Northerners who came down, who rushed down to take advantage of these opportunities, they felt like they were not just taking advantage of opportunities, but taking advantage of the people, the desperation of the people. And this is going to help spur lingering resentment. They get known as carpetbaggers. And there was a time in this part of the country where calling somebody a carpetbagger was going to end up in a fight. And about the only thing worse than a carpetbagger was a scalawag. And a scalawag was a southerner who was doing essentially the same thing as a carpetbagger. But the carpetbagger at least wasn't from here. He was an outsider, and you expect that. But a scalawag was someone from here who would help them. So they're not just cheating people and everything, they're betraying people. Okay. Another problem with the economic damage and the fact that there's no cash means that landowners can't afford to pay wages to their laborers. They'd never really had a whole lot of cash anyway. The plantation owners, they didn't have most of their wealth in cash. It was tied up in property, including the slaves. Well, now they've, of course, lost that value, so they don't have that anymore. But now they can't afford to pay laborers. But if they don't get people farming, then everybody starves. And so what they come up with is a new system called sharecropping, where you provide land and usually a place to stay and the tools and the seed and everything to a family. They then go out and grow the crop on your land, harvest it, and they get paid in a share of the crop, hence the term sharecropping. So they may grow 100 bales of cotton, and they'll get 5, and you'll get 95. Okay, and I'm just using that as round numbers. That's not exactly, I mean, that's not exactly a scientifically produced number or anything. It's just an example. And what happens is, of course, you can only then sell that cotton after you've harvested it. You do that once a year, and so you get paid essentially once a year. So how do you pay your bills the rest of the year? How do you get food and things? Well, you borrow money. And the person that you borrow money from is usually the person who owns the store. Who usually owns the store? The guy who used to own the plantation. So now you're working for the guy who used to own the plantation. You're still not getting paid cash. And then when you need things, because you can't get to any other place to shop. I mean, it's not like they've got a bus system yet to carry you off somewhere, or cars or anything like that. So you get stuck there because year after year, your debt is about what you're going to end up making. And so you get into this cycle of poverty. So while it's not quite slavery, they did, by the way, make it illegal to leave while you owed money. So while it's not quite slavery, it is not good. It traps people, both black and white, into a cycle of poverty that's going to last for years and years and years. And it's going to take 35 years for the Southern economy to return to the productivity of 1860. That's the year I was looking for earlier. I exaggerated it a bit. 1860 to 1895 takes 35 years for that to happen, according to Ludwell Johnson in his book Division and Reunion. So how does it all come to an end? Well, let's look at that. One of Grant's weaknesses was that he placed way too much faith in people that he thought were his friends and supported them. Loyalty is a good thing, but when you're loyal to the wrong people, it's not so good. And Grant was loyal to some of the wrong people. And that led to several scandals during his terms of office. The most famous was probably the Credit Mobilier scandal, where stockholders in the Union Pacific Railroad bribed congressmen with large amounts of stock worth millions of dollars to prevent Congress investigating the Union Pacific Railroad for misappropriation of federal funds, because the railroad was financed in large part by the U.S. government. And essentially, the stockholders had lined their own pockets with the money. with all sorts of faked overruns and things like that. The other big scandal is the whiskey ring, and this was where distillers and the federal agents who were supposed to be keeping an eye on them to make sure that the taxes were collected conspired to not turn in the taxes. And so basically the agents reported that the distillers were making far less whiskey than they were in order to get a payment, and the whiskey distillers saved money by not paying taxes on a lot of the whiskey that they were making. Grant's private secretary was implicated as one of the leaders of this, and he went to the mat for this guy, and it turns out the guy was in it up to his neck. He was absolutely guilty. And that, of course, shakes public confidence in Grant, who was fairly popular as an individual and as the guy who won the war, but these scandals are going to definitely weaken Republican control in the federal government, and they end up losing lots of seats in Congress to the Democrats. And this is going to set up the fall of Republican control and the end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction comes to an end basically because of the result of the presidential election of 1876. There are 20 electoral votes that are disputed, meaning that both sides try to claim them. And it makes a big difference because without them, Rutherford B. Hayes can't win. And so what happens is, in the Compromise of 1877, they're going to push all 20 of those votes to Hayes, who then wins by one vote. Now, he really probably should have gotten them, but the Congress goes ahead and pushes it to him, because if they stay disputed, sorry about that, if they stay disputed, then there's no clear winner. It goes to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is still got a lot of radical Republicans in it. It gets really kind of messy. And so basically what happens is that the House comes up with a deal, and they agree to push all the votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, who then wins by one vote, 185 to 184. It is literally as close as you can get and still become president. In return, Hayes has to agree to withdraw all of the remaining federal troops from the South, which means effectively Reconstruction will be over. Because as soon as the soldiers are gone, as soon as the military districts are dismantled, as soon as that happens, the local Democrats, the Redeemer Democrats, take power once again, and they push everybody else back out. They push the Republicans back out. They run the African Americans that have gotten elected out of office. They do as much as they can to start reversing the changes that had happened during Reconstruction. And here are the electoral results. Just two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. Hayes is the Republican candidate. You can see that he wins the North pretty handily, the big states, but, well, not all of them, but Tilden, the Democrat, wins virtually the same number, and you actually get a tie in the Electoral College between the two, okay? A virtual tie. And so, well, there's 20 contested votes, and those 20 votes are going to tilt it one way or the other. So Hayes actually had 165 to Tilden's 184, but those 20 votes end up going to Hayes, giving him 185 and pushing him just over. Okay. And if you look at the popular vote, you can see that the Democrat actually had quite a few more votes than the Republican. So that's, people talked about that in the recent elections because it's happened a couple of times recently where the person who had the most popular vote did not win the Electoral College and therefore didn't become president. So it's not a brand new thing is my point. That's happened before. It will happen again. It's just part of how our system works. And here's a political cartoon that was in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper back in the day. And it says, all aboard for the North, carpetbaggers especially requested to avail themselves. Basically, you have the conductor, who is President Rutherford B. Hayes, escorting all of the carpetbaggers and scalawags, putting them on a train and sending them north as part of the new policy and the end of Reconstruction. Well, everyone, we have come to the end. It's been a tough semester and a long one, I know, but here we are. You're done. Hope you enjoyed this series. I hope you learned something. It's been tough, but I appreciate those of you that hung in with it. And now all you have left to do is take your final test. You're all done then. You have until Friday. No, sorry, not Friday. Thursday, the 14th. At the end of the day, I have to turn my grades in on Friday, so I need you done with the test no later than Thursday the 14th of May. And I wish you good luck with all of your future classes. I'll have grades in probably by the midday on the 15th. All right, thanks, and have a great summer. Goodbye.